We're going to begin this session with Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. If there are two men who can be characterized as delighting in the law of the Lord, as described in Psalm 1, it is John Helston and Donald Brake. And Houston Baptist University and all who visit the Dunham Bible Museum are great beneficiaries of the delight these two gentlemen have in the scriptures. For over 30 years, they both have collected rare editions of the Bible, which now are part of the Dunham Bible Museum's collection. For half of that time, they have partnered together in forming the Living Word National Bible Museum, producing major exhibits in key cities. You have in your packet a pamphlet that features some of the fine volumes that they have collected. This was something put out for one of their previous exhibits. Dr. Helston is going to tell briefly the story of the Living Word National Bible Museum before he introduces Dr. Brake to us. Dr. Helston is an ordained minister who received his doctorate at Harvard Divinity School and Andover Newton Theological Seminary. He spent 20 years as an Air Force chaplain, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He is a man with a pastor's heart, a passion for God's word, a loving for sharing it with others, and a man of fervent prayer. So please welcome Dr. John Helston.
Isn't this a wonderful conference? And under the direction of Dr. Severance, how privileged we are to be a part of this. It's my privilege for over 20 years to have known Dr. Donald Brake, not as as a teacher in the seminary where he was held several different positions there as a professor, as dean of students, as finally the dean of Multnomah Biblical Seminary, but to know him as a friend and as a colleague in a special ministry of Bible exhibits. I first wrote to Dr. Donald Brake while he was in the late 1980s, while he was at Multnomah, and shared something of my collection with him, knowing that he had a great collection of early English Bibles and also Greek texts, and shared as well some of the vision that I had of a Bible museum that would share in dramatic ways through media, as well as the ancient artifacts, some of the dramatic story of the history of our Bible. After one correspondence, I think, from Multnomah, my next correspondence came back from Jerusalem. Dr. Brake had taken a position there as president for a period of time at the Institute of Holy Land Studies, as it was called at that particular time. And Don shared with me that that would have been something of his vision and dream as well, to have the Bible's dramatic story told through the artifacts and through media. It was maybe 2 years after that Don returned to Dallas, Texas, there to work with a son for a period of time and also to do pastoral work. Our first meeting was at a Denny's restaurant, and it was like two brothers had come together to share a common desire that what this might be in terms of exposure to the history of our Bible to the general public. Our first exhibit was in Fort Worth, Texas, at the Museum of Science and History, we produced a short film on the life of William Tyndall at the Southern Baptist Radio and Television. And so for 9 months, we were there with just a few volumes, about 24 volumes, of some of the early manuscript period, the early printed period, and then on into the English Bible that is our own personal history. From there we went to the Biblical Arts Center in Dallas, and for a period of a year we shared that along with some more media that we developed, along with also a replica of the Gutenberg press, so people could see what truly began to happen in that 15th century that made the Bible finally available in great copies, and of course just changed the world in so many different ways. It was responded to greatly, and they extended that for another half a year, so it was about 18 months that we were there. From there we launched on out to Branson, Missouri, and were there for 2 years. And it was truly there that for the first time in these exhibits, as with the media, as well as my opportunity to be with there personally, some great insights began to come that when you're telling the history of our Bible and telling about Wycliffe and Luther and Tyndall and some of these others, as they're seeing the very artifacts that these people have produced, you're also relating the gospel. And some great things began to happen there, that as people were exposed to the great history of our Bible. From there it was Tulsa, Oklahoma for about 3 years. Part of the time I was there, and other times volunteers that just simply wanted to also were excited about the history of our scriptures, helped out to extend that for that period of time. So it is in that relationship as friend with Dr. Brake, as we brought our collections together to tell this story and to work together in these various means, that I am privileged to call him a friend and a colleague. When you're talking about a friend, you also perhaps realize that there's always things you learn about a friend as you move along. And so on our trip down from Fort Worth and Dallas, and yesterday, I also learned that he was right out of high school, tried out for the St. Louis Cardinals. I think we're thankful that he didn't take that as a career. Maybe at the time he felt that was quite a something that he did not want, but instead he's this person that you read about here, who is a scholar, who is an author, who in so many ways he has contributed to the life of not the church, but also the enthusiasm and inspiration that the history of our Bible gives to us. So I might just add one more word. Over the years, he's come to know the truth, however, and he is a Texas Ranger fan now. But it is a privilege to introduce to you Dr. Donald Brake.
Well, I see most of you are dressed in red. That's not cardinal red, I hope. That game last night sort of ripped out my heart, so I'm a little hurting today, so you can feel sorry for me if you'd like, and show me a little bit of mercy and pity. The 400th anniversary of the King James Version has been on my heart for a number of years, and not for 400, but for several. And two of the things that I wanted to do in celebration of the 400th anniversary of this wonderful edition was to write a book on the history of it, not really analyzing necessarily the text of it as much as how did it come to us, how was it printed, what is the physical attributes of this wonderful version. That was the first thing that I wanted to do, and so I did the book which I call A Visual History of the King James Bible. Of course, Even though this venue is too large for us, I figured since I am writing books on visual history, I really should use some visual aids. So that's why we've come into this room to show some of these. So one of it was to write the book on the visual history of the King James Version from its inception up until its latest, well, that's not working for me. Am I going the right direction? There we go. The second is I wanted to write a modern history of the King James Version. And we did that by, John and I decided that we wanted to do a census of all known King James versions in the world. So we began a worldwide search for all King James first editions. There are a lot of King James Bibles if you look at second, third, fourth, and so forth. But we wanted to do just the first editions of the King James Bible, which we now call a He Bible. And so throughout the several years, I have been making contacts with and trying to find out where every known first edition King James Bible is. And we put that into a census and put it into a leather-covered book that commemorates this great anniversary of the King James Version. You can see some of them outside there. But it was something that I felt was very important to the modern history of this ancient version. And so I've called it a Royal Monument of English Literature. And I believe that's a very good title for what the King James Version has done for us. My interest in the whole idea of the history of the English Bible really comes as a collector originally, because I began to, although I taught the scriptures on canonicity and the history of the Greek text and the Hebrew Bible and the English Bible, my real passion was for collecting these various Bibles so that I could trace from the time that it was given to the original prophets and apostles all the way up till today, so that I could show that it had not changed in between that time. Because I was often asked, well, how do we know that the Bible we have today is the same Bible we had in those when it was originally given? So I was sort of trying to develop that history. So I wanted papyri of the New Testament. I wanted Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, all the way up through all the English Bibles and the Greek New Testaments as well. So that's how I got my interest in the whole area of the development of the English Bible. But my real experience came with my first encounter with a King James He Bible, a first edition, which if you're a collector, it's the foundation of all collections. If you don't have a King James He Bible, 1611, you're really not with it. So I figured I had to have one, and I began collecting. Well, I'm just a lowly teacher, and raising a family. I am not wealthy, never was wealthy, never will be wealthy. So I had to figure out by hook and by crook how to collect these things. And my first encounter came when a auction house down in California sent me a catalog of things that were going up for sale to be bid on. And one of them was a King James He Bible. Well, I read through the description, and it sounded like there were a lot of things missing in it. A lot of pages missing, a lot of tears, a lot of destruction. And so they wanted $10,000 to $12,000. Well, you can tell how old this was, many years ago. And so I said, okay, no way I can buy that Bible. That's ridiculous. That's as much as I make in a year. So I said, okay, I'm going to make a bid of $7,000 on it. Why? Because I wanted them to know I was interested in rare Bibles, so that they would send me more catalogs. And I knew that generally speaking, when you have something that's estimated to go at $10,000 or $12,000, they have a reserve on it, which would be about $8,000. So I figured I'll offer $7,000. That way I won't get it, but they'll know I'm interested in it. So I made my bid, and I sat back and went on about my life's business, and all of a sudden one day I get a bill. $7,000. Well, you can imagine what my wife said about that. Well, I could not possibly write back and say I'm not going to take it, because that would ruin my reputation. They would never sell me anything. So we emptied all of our cash and all of our credit cards, and I sent off and bought that Bible. So I called them up and I said, why did you sell this to me for $7,000? I didn't think that would be possible. And they said, well, when we got your bid in the mail, we called the lady who lived in San Francisco and told her that we had no other bids on it. And he said he was surprised that nobody had bid on it. But the description of the condition of it scared most of the bidders away. So nobody had bid on it. And he asked her, we have one bid for $7,000. Will you sell it for that? And she said, yes. So that's how I ended up with it. Well, when I got it, that description was wrong. Those were not missing pages. Those were wrinkled pages. And so they got their commas in the wrong place, and so it ends up to being a really nice Bible. And so, of course, how am I going to pay for this thing? So I decided to sell it to another guy, and I made a little profit on it, which I could buy from my next Bible. And I made him promise, now I get the first right of refusal if you ever decide to sell that. Oh, and he assured me that that would be the case. However, he reneged on his word. He sold that Bible without telling me several years later, and so I've lost track of it. I don't know exactly where it is. So I'd love to have that thing back. But anyway, that really got me excited about getting a King James Bible and getting more Bibles. And I'd already had several by this time, but they were second and third editions and smaller things. So that's how I really became interested in a visual history of developing of the King James Bible. Well, today, the King James Version can be purchased in shopping malls, over the internet, read on Kindle, disc, iPhone, iPad, or simply as a book. You probably thought the only thing I knew about that was the book part, didn't you? Well, you're about right. I'm worried that books are going to go out of business one of these days, and you're going to have to carry a computer around with you all the time, or a Kindle. But you probably have a copy of the King James Version in your home, maybe several copies, probably in your office. I mean, it's just read everywhere. It's a very, very common and very popular Bible, even today. Even though most people believe it's not the best translation that we have today, it is still very, very popular. In fact, it's number 2 in the selling list of Bibles in America, and it's probably even greater than that if you count worldwide sales. And that doesn't count things that are sold in England. It doesn't count things that are downloaded from the internet as well. And why has it been so enduring? I guess that's the question that all of us have, because most scholars today will say, no, you shouldn't use the King James Version. In fact, what I've noticed is, as I've talked about this so much, that there are kind of two popular opinions that are poles apart. One says the King James Version is worthless. It ought to be put on the shelves with all the other relics and move on. Others say, no, the King James Bible is the only Bible we should read. In fact, if there's a difference between the Greek and the Hebrew with the King James, we ought to correct the Greek and the Hebrew. So those are kind of parallel views, and I take something in the middle. But I love the King James Version. I want you to know that right now. Even though I think there are other better translations of the Greek and the Hebrew, I love the King James Version. And here's some of the reasons why. Why it has been so enduring, why we love it so much. It's the cadence and the rhythms that's in the text that are just draws us to that literary beauty. Look at these verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters. I mean, there's just something about that that's unmatched in modern translations. It has a beauty and a cadence of its own. I am totally non-musical. I mean, if there's a person that can't carry a tune, I would certainly be that person. I just don't understand music. I like to hear it, but I don't understand it. In the churches where I go, either when I'm in Washington State or when I'm up in Flower Mound, are very large churches. They have great bands up there, and they can beat out some wonderful music and praise songs and all of that. And people really get into it, and they praise God through songs and through these kinds of hymns that we have. I do the same thing with reading of the King James Version. It's got a cadence to me that I can worship God almost as if those are His words, just like you might do in a beautiful hymn or a praise song. You hear those words, and it just lifts your heart up to God. That's what really the King James Version does for me. Again, as one author said, if you don't read it all the time, you should at least read it some of the time. And I think that's a good thing for us, to read it and just to enjoy it. And when we get ready to do our exegesis, we can do that with another translation. Many of the phrases, as you've heard these over and over again all year long as we've celebrated the 400th anniversary, so many of these phrases are integrated into our language today. Things like to fall flat on your face, a man after his own heart, the land of the living, sour grapes, pride goes before a fall, like a lamb to the slaughter, the salt of the earth, a thorn in the flesh, to give up the ghost. I mean, these are all things that are part of our English language, and even young people may use some of these and not even know that they come from the Bible, the King James Version. Well, we know that politically, historically, much of the history of the English Bible is intertwined with the history of Henry VIII and his problems. You remember that. By the way, I'm just reviewing a film from BYU. Their media has just done a film on the making of the King James Bible, and it's really a fine film. It's got some very fine scholars that have talked about it. But anyway, what it has done, it has integrated a lot of Tyndale, a lot of the early English Bibles, very well with the history of the Tudor family and Henry VIII and all of his wives and all of that argument. Without Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and Catherine, without that triangle of that love triangle or whatever you want to call it, we might not have an English Bible the way we have it today, because it was forbidden in that day. But because Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church and formed his own, even though he probably never left the Roman Catholic faith himself, that gave rise and permission ultimately for the permission to print a Bible in the English language. So that was a wonderful thing, even though the history of it is pretty sad. Queen Elizabeth, as you know, was the final Tudor queen, and she passed, when she died, she passed the ruling house over to the Tudor house, and that was James VI of England, or James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And that was a very large movement, and the history behind that is really important to the development of how the King James Bible came into being. I'll leave that for you to read in the book or some of the other books, but it was a very important period. But Elizabeth had really left the church in shambles, and the financial situation of England was in peril when she left the throne. And so James really wanted to unite. He was a king that desired to see all of the religious factions come together. And that was another big step in the making of the King James Version. Once he was appointed as king, he traveled from Scotland down into England in a kingly fashion. He distributed knighthoods and made promises as he traveled his route from Scotland to England. And this is about 1603, because he did want to unite the church. James himself was a scholar in his own right. He's often said that if he was not in the royal family, it would not have been king, he would have been an academic. He was a fine scholar, though there's no evidence that he actually participated himself in any of the translation work. He certainly would have known enough of the languages to be able to do that. Well, in his procession down somewhere along the line, he was met by a group of Puritans. And these Puritans presented him with a number of their complaints of the church, several practices. opposing the rites such as using a ring in marriage rituals, bowing at the name of Jesus, making the sign of the cross at baptism, reading the Apocrypha in the services, creating excess dresses for the clerics, and following the practice of excommunication. These were some of the complaints that the Puritans had toward the Anglican Church. And at this point, everybody thought King James was going to be on their side, because in Scotland, you have more of the Presbyterians, and you have the Anglican type down in England, and so they both thought that James would support them. So James decided to call a conference, and he called a conference at Hampton Court in 1604, and that conference was designed really to talk about these complaints that the Anglican Church had. He wanted, again, to unite everybody, so he wanted to sort of calm this down. And he would call different groups in individually and talk to them, the Puritans and then the Anglicans, trying to find out what all their complaints are and find some unifying ground. And that conference lasted, I believe it was for about 3 days. Now, they met in Hampton Court because of the plague. The plague was in London. Hampton Court is just outside of London. And the plague was there, just enveloping everybody and killing a lot of people. And so they, for their own safety, they moved out to Hampton Court, where they began to hold the conference. At one point, the Anglicans, as you heard this morning in one of the lectures, the Anglicans used the Bishop's Bible. The Bishop's Bible was originally done in 1568, and it was acceptable by the Anglicans, but almost only the Anglican priest and the hierarchy. The people really did not like the Bishop's Bible very much. It was not very popular. There's a kind of an interesting phrase in it, in Psalm 45:9. Ophir is thought to be in the land in the west coast of the late found of Christopher Columbus, and whence at this day is brought most fine gold. So this is even listed in a note at Psalm 45:9 in the Bishop's Bible. So the Bishop Bible was a huge thing. It was beautifully printed. It's one of the finest printings of the 16th century. And today, when you compare, you see it in the museum, you compare it with others, it is really beautifully done. The interesting thing about writing books and doing this census is I have people write to me. And so I had this Carol Regier write to me, and she sent me a picture of her two cousins. And this is a Bishop's Bible owned by Edwin Sandy. Edwin Sandy was one of the translators of the Bishop's Bible. So she sent me a picture of them holding that Bible in a small town, in a small school in England. So the Bishop's Bible was a beautifully done book, and actually it was not a bad translation. It was pretty stiff and stilted, and so it wasn't very popular. The Puritans supported the Geneva Bible, and you heard about that this morning as well. The Geneva Bible was done in 1560 by those who had fled Queen Bloody Mary from England and had gone into Geneva, and there William Whittingham, along with a number of other translators, translated the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is important for several reasons, and primarily it's because of the format that it took. And you heard about that again this morning as well. It was in a small, handy form. It was in Latin letter, not the big black Gothic letter. It was the first one to have verse divisions, and it's the same verse divisions virtually that we use today. And it was first in the English Bible, was used in the Geneva Bible. And it had, of course, the major feature of it was it had notes. It was the first study Bible, the Geneva Study Bible. I'm sure everybody flocked out to get a Geneva Study Bible, so they could not only know the text, but they could have the explanation of it. But it was very popular because of the format. It was easy to read. It was a good translation. And so the Puritans accepted it, while the Anglicans preferred the Bishop's Bible. So in the midst of the conference, where they're arguing about these various church issues, one man rose up, and his name was Reynolds, and he said, I think we should have a new translation. Of course, he was a Puritan, and probably what he was hoping for everybody to say is, oh yes, let's use the Geneva Bible. It's probably the best of them. Well, to his surprise, someone else stood up and said, we can't use that translation. If we were to use translations that everybody used, there'd be no end of translations. Well, that sounds like today, doesn't it? And so King James then rose and said, why, that's a great idea. He says, I am tired of all these translations we have had, and they're bad translations, and the worst one of all is the Geneva Bible. Well, I'm sure Reynolds sat down quickly and shut up. But so he liked the idea, and so he began the process of what we know today as the King James Version. In the Sum and Substance, which is a declaration in 1604 of what happened at the meeting that brought this about, and the original writing of the choosing of the translators, it says, whereupon His Highness wished that some special pains should be taken in that behalf for one uniform translation, and this to be done by the best learned in both the universities, after them to be reviewed by the bishops and the chief learned of the church, and lastly to be ratified by His royal authority. So the idea was that he was going to appoint translators that were the best scholars of the land. And I liked what was mentioned this morning in one of the lectures, where, these men, when they learned these languages, they really learned the languages. In fact, the translators whose native language was English often discussed the translation principles in using the medium of language of Latin. So they really knew their languages. I was happy to hear about some of the scholars in the Hebrew aspect of it, because I've spent most of my time in the study and the thinking of it in the terms of the Greek New Testament. So the Sum and Substance points out that the king really wanted the greatest of scholars to do the translation, because they wanted it to be accurate. Their goal was to have an English word for every Greek and Hebrew word. And that's why you have the italic words in there, which represent words that need to be in there for the English language understanding, but were not actually in either the Greek or the Hebrew. So he wanted really the finest scholars. I laugh about a man by the name of Broughton, who was one of the greatest Hebrew scholars in England, was denied a place as one of the translators, even though he was one of the great Hebrew scholars. But he was a type of man that was so cantankerous that his opinion was the only opinion, and so they believed that he would cause so much trouble and heartache among all the translators that they decided to leave him off. After the translation was done, he wrote a scathing review of the King James Version, saying that it was the devil's tool, that the devil did most of the translation. But he never once mentions anything about the genealogy, which is probably 20 pages, because he helped do that. And so he, I'm sure, said everything is really poor except the genealogies. So they did want to have all the great scholars, and so James appointed, and he was right in the midst of the appointments, although he used others to help him make that decision. He appointed Bishop Bancroft, by the way, is probably one of the main people in gathering all these scholars together. It was probably intended that there would be 48 scholars, 8 in each of the companies, because they divided it up into 6 groups, 2 from Westminster, 2 from Cambridge, and 2 from Oxford, and probably 8 translators in each one of those. But we have lists of these translators that add up to 54. So we know that there were at least 54 translators, but probably because some of them died during the translation, and they were replaced by someone else. Speaking of being killed. So they replaced some of those who had died or had resigned their post, and then some of them we have no information about who they were, whether or not they were really qualified or not, but probably in the neighborhood of 54, maybe even more, actually took place in the translation. But in one of the principles, James insisted that after everybody, all these others had reviewed the work, they would take it even to further, to outsiders, to scholars who would look it over. So they really intended this to be the very best scholarship in all of England. There were 15 rules that they set out that would be governing them. These 15 rules, one of them, as we heard this morning, was the use of the Bishop's Bible as the main one. No notes were to be used, especially the kind in the Geneva Bible. Only notes that had to do with clarifications of something that might not be quite so clear. So they had these rules that were very important to them, and they set them out. Now, this is quite different than anybody else's translation that we heard from the time of Wycliffe all the way up through the King James Version. There were really no rules established. They had some idea of how to translate, but they did not have specific rules. This is a copy that is in the Manifold Greatness exhibit. The Manifold Greatness exhibit is an exhibit of the celebration of the 400th anniversary that's going around the U.S. to about 45, I believe, or 40 different institutions. It's sponsored by, I believe it's Oxford and the Shakespeare Library in Washington, or the Library of Congress. I've kind of forgotten which one. But they have copies of the actual listing of the translators, which I have pictured here. And these translators, and then also one of the manuscripts that we'll talk about in a minute. But there were a number of rules for translation, and here is a listing of some of those rules for translation. It's interesting that none of them have anything to do with style. Now, when modern-day translating groups get together, and almost all translations today are done by committees. Large numbers of scholars throughout the country are chosen, and they do the translations. Often, one of the big things they talk about is the style. What kind of reading style should it be? It has to be something, not only do you read to yourself, but something that can be read from the pulpit and be understood by the people and have a nice rhythm to it and so forth. There is no such rule like that in the King James Version. And someone has said the greatest miracle of all is how you can get the King James Version, the greatest translation perhaps in history, to be put together by a committee. You know, a camel is a horse put together by a committee. And so to get something so wonderful done by a committee seems to be almost a miracle. But they had these rules for translation. They had a lot of translators that are doing it, but none of those rules said anything about style, except one. And this is pointed out in a book that says, rules number 6 says, no marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of Hebrew and Greek words, which cannot, without some circumlocution, so briefly and fitly be expressed in the text. Now, that term today means a roundabout or indirect way of speaking, using more words than necessary, rambling, meandering, verbosity. That's what we call someone who would be practicing circumlocution. Whereas a dictionary by Thomas Wilson back in 1553 describes it as a large description either to set forth a thing more glorious lie or else to hide it. In other words, it allows for sort of extra meaning in it. And I think that does have to play with style among the King James translators, because there are instances where you can see that they're trying to make the sentence so that you make the actual translation of what it means. They've translated to leave room for two various sort of ideas about it. And so that may be how they came up with the style, but they did not officially try to have style as a part of the process, though it ended up that way. A number of the scholars that were in this, Miles Smith, who was the final reviser and wrote the preface, was a wonderful scholar, especially a Hebrew scholar. Lancelot Andrews is one of the great scholars of the period. He did Genesis through 2 Kings. Sir Henry Saville, who did Matthew through Acts, John Reynolds, who was the Puritan scholar. By the way, I just want to mention that although they did invite some Puritans on the committee, they were all moderate Puritans. They had lots of Anglicans, but a few Puritans, but they were only moderate Puritans. They weren't the right-wing Puritans that might cause trouble or might insist on certain doctrinal words and so forth. Now, what I always say is before we make and set all these scholars of the King James Version up on great pedestals, let's think about them for just a minute. There were several men that we can talk about. For instance, John Overall. John Overall married Anne Ortwell, and there's a description of her which, as you read it, describes a very, very beautiful woman. But evidently he couldn't hold her, and she eloped with Sir John Selby, and she ran off with him. And so Overall was so angry that he sent after her, and they brought her back forcibly, and she stayed with him then the rest of her life. We don't hear any more about her after that. So he may have chained her to a bed somewhere, I don't know. Roger Andrews, who was the brother of Lancelot Andrews, who was one of the great translators of the period. He was a brother of Lancelot, and he was actually fired for stealing funds from the church. And then there's George Abbott. George Abbott was accused of murder. He went out hunting. And in the midst of the thicket, they were sure they saw that big prize stag, and he shot his gun off and hit the stag, except it was the gamekeeper. And so he killed the gamekeeper, and he was accused of murder. And later on, it changed it to manslaughter. So I always say it's not only vice presidents that get in trouble for going hunting, so do bishops. So George Abbott, it was really a tragic thing for George because he was finally acquitted of all charges, but he lost all of his authority and power in the church. So it was a monumental event in his life. Samuel Ward, it says he loved wine and beer. He lusted after women, and he loved eavesdropping on conversations. I like that statement because they put in parallel wine and beer, lusting after women, along with eavesdropping on conversations. So if you eavesdrop, it's almost equal to drinking and loving wine and beer and lusting after women, or I guess after men too. So anyway, this was, so what I'm saying is they were great scholars, but they were also very flawed people. And so we need not put them all up on great saintly stands and make something out of them that they were not. They were scholars, but they were just like the rest of us. They were very human. They made a lot of mistakes, just like we often do. I often get the question about William Shakespeare, and I was interested in this display that's going around on Manifold Greatness. They have actually traced back where all this came from, but some have said that Shakespeare, because he was such a great writer, and he was writing in this very period that we're talking about, he must have been involved in the translation of the Bible because it is such a great piece of prose, and Shakespeare was a great writer. He must have been involved. And so some have said, because we go to Psalm 46, if we count 46 lines down from the top, we come to the word shake. If we count 46 words up from Psalm 46, we come to the word spear. Therefore, Shakespeare is hiding the fact that he translated at least Psalm 46. And by the way, he was 46 years old. So obviously, he has to be the translator of Psalm 46. Well, I think it is a strange coincidence, by the way, but Shakespeare, his family was all Roman Catholic. Shakespeare himself, we don't know what he was. He quotes mostly from the Geneva Bible, from the Bishop's Bible, from the Tyndale Bible. I mean, he quotes in his works from all these various authors. And about a year ago, we had a conference here in which one of the leading world Shakespeare scholars spoke and talked about that as well. So Shakespeare probably quoted from a lot of different books, Bibles, but that doesn't make him a religious man. In fact, one of the great writers of today, who's written on the history of the King James Version in the 400th year, says, "Well, I'm not an atheist, but I'm not a churchgoer either." So you can write great pieces of literature and great works without really believing everything that someone might think you should believe. And so Shakespeare, his family, especially his mother, was very strong Roman Catholic. However, he was buried in an Anglican cemetery. His will was made out to a number of his family, and they were Roman Catholics. Shakespeare was not a churchman, and all of the translators were churchmen. So there's very little evidence that Shakespeare, in fact, there's zero evidence that Shakespeare translated anything in the King James Version. The only possible would be this coincidence that comes in Psalm 46. Now, what I would like to do, though I don't have my bishop's Bible anymore, it's in the museum, I'd like to go to the bishop's Bible and count down 46 in it and 46 up and see if it comes to Shakespeare in that version or if any of the other versions do that. But I haven't checked that yet, so some of you young people can do that as an assignment sometime. So, the Greek New Testaments that were used to make the King James Version, undoubtedly it was based on Erasmus' text of 1522. Erasmus was the first one to do a printed Greek New Testament. He used 5 manuscripts, and they were late-date manuscripts, but he used 5 of them. Some of the book of Revelation was missing in the book of Revelation, and so he translated it back from Latin into Greek. And that still, by the way, some of that still exists in the King James Version today, which has no real authority for it. Erasmus did his first one in 1516, but his third edition in 1522 is the one used by Tyndale and is used by all the rest of the King James, or all the rest of the translations up and including the King James. The second edition, which is 1519, was the edition used by Luther in his translation of the German Bible. So it was Erasmus' original Greek New Testament that became the basis for the King James Version, though it wasn't actually his version. It was modified a little bit by Stephanus in 1550, and Stephanus' Greek New Testament in 1551 was the first Greek Testament to ever use verse divisions, and it's the same verse divisions that were used by the Geneva Bible that we mentioned just about 10 years later. But there's a story that goes around to how Stephanus chose the verse divisions, because if you read through, or if you're in classes or Sunday school classes, sometimes a teacher might say, you know, the punctuation, the verse really should include this next one too. Well, that's because they say that he was fleeing from Paris to another town, and he was riding on his horse, and he was marking his verses that he was riding on his horse, and every time it bounced, he made a mark for his verse division. So that shows why they are so mixed up in how they ended up. Probably the real reason he did the verse division was so he could do a concordance. By dividing it up, it's easier to refer to verses when you do a concordance. So anyway, Stephanus was the first one to use verse divisions, and the ones we use. Actually, there was a Hebrew Bible in 1528 that actually used verse divisions in the margins, but they never did stick. It was really Stephanus that stuck. And then it was popularized by Beza, Theodore Beza, and that was really the one, probably the 1589 edition or the 1598 edition, that was actually the ones that were held by the King James translators as they translated the King James Version. Though I think the speaker this morning pointed out that it's very likely that they also were using these other versions. They weren't going only from the Greek and Hebrew into the King James Version, but they were undoubtedly using some of the other versions as well. So the Greek text that underlies, that's why so many are against the King James Version today, because a lot of the texts that we have in Greek today, especially in the New Testament, are earlier Greek texts. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, they're in the 4th century, whereas the Erasmus texts were almost all in the later centuries, probably about the 13th, 14th century. So that's why many today believe the King James Version is not based on the right text, and that's arguable. Scholars are arguing over that as well, and I've been on both sides of that argument, hearing them talk about that. Another event that took place during the translators of the King James Version, and that was what is called the Gunpowder Plot. There was a plot by Guy Fawkes and a number of Roman Catholics to blow up the Parliament building. They were going to blow up the king and all the Parliament members by putting gunpowder. Some say they dug a tunnel from the church into the Parliament building, although there's, I read just the other day that they can't really find any evidence of a tunnel there. But anyway, they were going to put in the basement of the Parliament building all this gunpowder and blow it up. This is sort of England's 9/11, if you will, because King James became paranoid at this period, at this time, and began to persecute Catholics like crazy. In fact, he even took a lot of it out on Puritans. In fact, some of the Puritans escaped to the continent and then on to America were because of James's paranoia after the Gunpowder Plot. It was, they foiled it, it did not happen, and though probably most of you know that today in England, every year with fireworks, they celebrate the foiled plot of Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was tortured for many days. You see where I have the blue line up there. This is a confession of the conspirators, and I've underlined Guy Fawkes' signature. He had been tortured and beaten so much to get him to confess that evidently his handwriting was very, very weak. And this was the result of it in his handwriting. This book describes it, the whole plot and everything in 1606, and that's in the museum as well. The real interesting thing about the King James Version, to me, is the mystery of the printing. We just don't know how that all took place. What did the translators take over and hand to Robert Barker and say, here, print the first edition of the King James Version? There are several possibilities. In fact, again, when I was doing the census, I got a note from University of Houston, who has a first edition King James Bible. And here was something we learned, confirmed for the first time. There's a note in it that says, this Bible was bought by William Cooper in Hereford, Robert Smith the elder, and John Hay, church wardens, and also brought this into this church upon the 17th day of January, 1612, a King James Version, which cost £3. It had really been foggy as to how much these Bibles sold for originally, how many were printed, and how much they sold for. And so we now know that this one sold for £3. There is a note in a diary, his name slipped me now, that said one sold for 47 sterling, and which, not pence, what's the other? Pardon? Yeah, and 47 of them divided by 20 makes it about 3 1/3 or 2 1/3 or so, 2.4 pounds, which is almost the same as what this one says. And so that's pretty close to the price. We don't know how many. Some have suggested as many as 20 or 30,000 of them were printed. I think it's more like between 1,500 and 2,500 were printed, because after 1611, he began to reprint them in 1613. And why so quickly if they had so many of them? So I think probably that's an overstatement of them. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting statement that was found in this one Bible. But the mystery of the printing is really something because of how many different variances there are among these copies. So what was that manuscript that was given to the King James translators? Some believe that it's in this manuscript, which is now called 98, which is headed An English Translation of the Epistles. It's 125 pages bound in vellum from the Lambeth Palace Library, and each one of these is ruled in red into two columns. One column is filled out, the other column is not. So some say because it says An English Translation of the Epistles, that this is the first edition of the King James Version that was given to the printer Barker to print. Well, that's probably not true because there are several different handwritings that are involved in it, and because it's incomplete, this is probably one of those copies that were passed around to various translators, and they would review other people's work, make additions, corrections, suggestions, and so forth, so that it's probably not, no one really believes today that this is the autograph of the King James Version. It's not complete as well. Then there's another way. Some say, it was an annotated bishop's Bible. It is said that there were a number of epistles. Well, let me show you what that looks like here. Nope, that's not what I wanted to show. There were 40 bound copies of the bishop's Bible that were passed out to the translators. They had those pages in loose leaves so that they would read that bishop's Bible, mark out something they didn't like, and put in their suggestions above it. And so the manuscript is very hard to read because of that. So some say that's the way they delivered it to Barker. They were the annotated bishop's Bible because they had handed out these 40 copies. Now, some people say, no, it can't possibly be a bishop's Bible because they were printed in 1602, and this is 1604. They would not have held all of those printing presses ready to print them for 2 years. But here's an interesting thing that I discovered from a man at the Stuttgart collection in Germany. He wrote me a letter and said, why in your book did you say that the coat of arms was cut out of the bishop's Bible? Now, let me explain. In 1541, the bishop's Bible was, the Great Bible. I said bishop's Bible, the Great Bible. The 1541 edition of the Great Bible had the coat of arms of Cromwell and Cranmer on it. When Cromwell fell out of favor with Henry VIII, as often happened to those who fell out of favor with Henry VIII, they took his coat of arms out, which is on the right-hand side of the 1541, on the right-hand side from you. Someone has filled this in with pen and ink, but it was actually chiseled out. So the volumes of 1541, you'll find, do not have the arms of Cromwell. Now, he sent me a photograph of a 1539 edition, and that coat of arms is out. The 1540 and all the 1539s I've ever seen all have a coat of arms in it. Notice the little spikes that go out from where they've carved that out. That's exactly the same as in the 1541 editions. So what I'm saying is that once Cromwell fell out of favor with Henry VIII, they went back and chiseled out those, however they did it. I say chisel, I don't know what they actually did, but they took out the coat of arms. They had left over 1539 editions, and so they took them out of there as well, which means that they had stacks of those even as late as 1541. So that makes me believe that it's very possible that the 1602 Bishop's Bible was still in stock, and they took those out and passed them around to the King James Version. So I think it's quite possible that that story, that these 40 different bishops' Bibles were passed out to the translators. In one of these in particular, and Ward Allen goes through these in detail in his book, which is a wonderful book, and he's really done a fine job on all of this. In the Bishop's Bible, it says, Elizabeth's time came that she should be delivered, and she brought forth a son. Now, there's a K and a lambda right in the text, and then there's the note which says the K means now, and the lambda was fulfilled, which means that those were to be added. So it was intended that it should read, now Elizabeth's time was fulfilled, that she should be delivered, and she brought forth a son. But after the meeting of these fellow translators, it came out, now Elizabeth's full time came, that she should be delivered, and she brought forth a son. The NIV says, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Now, obviously, the last one is the easiest to understand. I mean, that is just straightforward what is there. But is that what was intended? The idea that was after the meeting seems to suggest that there was, not only was she bringing forth a fulfillment of her birth to give birth to a son, but the fulfillment of John the Baptist was there. So there may be a slight meaning there, as Ward Allen points out. So anyway, if that's true, this is part of that idea of circumlocution, that there's in the King James translation, they also often leave a level there that helps you see that there may be more intent than just the words itself. Whereas the NIV, it's pretty obvious that they're just translating what the words are. And of course that's accurate. That's what it does say. So we don't know if the other was meant, but that's for you to all research. So the large number of differences between the bodily in 1602 and the King James make it extremely unlikely that the 1611 was printed from the bodily 1602 Bishop's Bible. So what did happen to it? Well, some suggest that the actual text, there's a mention in a pamphlet in 1660 that there was a copy of the New Translation. But there was a fire in 1666 which destroyed much of London, and many believe that that was included in that fire, so that if there were an actual autograph given to Barker, that it was destroyed in the fire of 1666. Nobody knows that for sure, but that's possible. That fire in 1666 was enormous. It destroyed more than 80 churches just in London. So we don't know really what was given. David Norton suggests that once they printed the first copy off of the King James Version, whatever they used to do that first copy with, they took it and made it the first edition. Now that makes sense in some degree because we have some of the same readings of the first edition in smaller, later prints, and we have different ones in the 1611, 1613 second edition, which follow a different train. So it's very possible that he's right. But anyway, that's more technical than you want to know. Yeah, forget all I said that. Okay. I'm going to skip that. There is a letter from William Eyre to Bishop Ussher. Bishop Ussher is the one who put the chronology that believes that the creation was 4004 BC. There was a letter written by William Eyre to him stating that King James wants you to get this done quickly. So there are some have said that, King James really never gave official approval of the King James Version. And that's true. But we know that he had a great hand in it. And if you can, calling it the King James Bible is a legitimate title for it because he certainly had a major part in that. The Privy Council documents between 1600 and 1613 were destroyed in a fire in 1622. So if that particular copy could have been destroyed at that point as well. So we don't really know what happened to the autograph, but that's a great mystery. What I want to do in the future is to do a study of the He Bible and the She Bible, which I'll mention to you in just a minute, which is the first and second edition, and trace those in the quartos and octavos, the smaller editions, and to see if the same readings all the way through are comparable. We call the first edition of the King James Version a He Bible, 1611, because of Ruth 3:15, which says, "And he went into the city." There's another version which was printed with a New Testament date of 1611, but an Old Testament date of 1613, which says, "And she went into the city." So the first edition says he, and the second edition says she. And so that's why we say that a first edition or a He Bible and a second edition or a She Bible. That's probably more than you want to know too, but there it is. Here's what two of the titles look like. The one on the left side is the first edition title of a He Bible. The one on the right-hand side is normally considered the second edition, and it is a different kind of woodcut. It's a woodcut instead of a copper plate, and it's dated 1613. Now, there's a lot more to be said about that than that, but I want to just make a couple of comments. There is also, which I have discovered in this latest census, that there are a number of He Bibles that have the same title form like the She Bible, except it's dated 1611. And some of them have been, some 1613s were altered to 1611. But there are some legitimate ones that are actually 1611. And in the Toledo Library, Toledo, Ohio Library, and in the Goober Library in Chicago, they both have this title page, which is a first edition, 1611, but it has the same framework as the She Bible. Now, in the cases that I've been able to verify, all the ones that have the 1611 on the left-hand side have this coat of arms on the back side of the title page of the genealogies. So it has made me conclude, and really to demonstrate what many have said before, and that is that the first edition is 1611, was the first one, had a copper plate which was destroyed sometime or other, probably dropped or wore out or something, and they replaced it with this title page, which is the same title page used in the Bishop's Bible, which was the basis for the King James. And so they used it for a few copies, and the later copies have the ornament of the arms, whereas the earlier editions do not. The ones with the original copper plate will not have that. It's a blank page instead of having the arms on it. Now that I may be confusing you a little bit, but there's a lecture for you. I'll give you a test on that a little bit. Okay, well, we're just about out of time here, so I just want to say a couple more things. There were a lot of printing errors, and this one you may be familiar with, but there were a lot of printing errors that took place because it was very profitable in printing Bibles. Everybody wanted to print Bibles, and so it was quite profitable. And so they did not do good editing. I don't know if you've ever written a book, you know the editors today are editors. They go through editing after editing after editing. They don't want one little comma wrong. I put a comma in italics one time, and the editor said that comma is in italics and it should be regular. Well, I couldn't even tell the difference by looking at it. So editors are editors, but in those days, they didn't edit very well. And here is a very big mistake that was made. Thou shalt commit adultery. That's called the Wicked Bible. Now, some believe that Barker, the printer Barker, took on some partners later, and they had a lot of legal problems and a lot of lawsuits between them, so that finally they got to the place where they hated each other, and that somebody came in and actually took the word "not" out just to destroy him, because it did cost him bankruptcy. And Barker went out of business and actually died in the poorhouse, as they say. So we talked a little bit this morning about the different revisions. The 1611 that we have today, I should say the King James Version that we have today is the revision done in 1769. It's not the original 1611 King James Version. It's undergone several revisions, major and minor. The ones I showed you were the major ones. There are a number of minor ones as well. And so if you go to this bookstore today and buy a King James Bible, you're buying the edition of 1769. The legacy, the standard by which all translations are measured today is the King James Version. After 400 years, it's still read worldwide and the primary Bible for thousands. Its literary beauty, cadence, and diction make it a royal monument of English literature. For millions, the language of the King James Version is the very voice of God. Its principles shape the foundation of American judicial system. From 17th century to the 21st century, literary authors, musical composers, and politicians have gravitated to the beauty of the King James Version. It's a wonderful piece of literature, but we do not worship the King James Bible. We worship the God of the Bible. So remember that. It's not something that we have to elevate. The words of the King James Bible were read over rough-hewn tables in the early homes of American settlers and carried in saddlebags of circuit-riding preachers. Its principles shaped the foundation of the American judicial system, and its truth produced a democracy that would serve as a beacon of hope to the world. Whatever its shortcomings, it is destined to endure without peer as long as faith exists and the English language survives. Selah.